Hey guys, I hope you're doing really well. I mentioned in my last review that I wanted to do more videos, and I also want to read more books, so I thought I could put those things together and talk about the books I've read in videos. A bit like PewDiePie, only with 80 million less subscribers? I've been on a bit of an Icelandic binge lately. I think the last 5 or 6 books I've read have been either translated from Icelandic or about Iceland, or both. And I finished this last night. It is The Legacy by Yrsa Sigurdardottir. Note that it's not called that in Icelandic. If you're looking for it, sometimes it comes up as DNA, which is what it's called in Icelandic. DNA meaning exactly the same thing in that language as it does in English, so I don't know why they changed it. There's no need, it means the same thing. And for me, the title DNA fits better with what happens in the book than the title The Legacy, but whatever, it's just the title. Yrsa Sigurdardottir is reasonably big in Iceland. She's regarded as like the queen of Icelandic crime writing. This is her 10th adult novel, and she's also written some children's books, so she's fairly prolific. Note also that this is the first book in a new series. It's called the Children's House series. It's not part of her other detective series that I think has 6 books in it, and she's got some standalones as well. It's not either of those. It's the first book of a new series of which we're to expect 2 more. This book was a bit of a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, there were a few scenes, one in particular, that were very, very intense and actually scared me one time to the point that I needed to go and shut the window in my house because it was making things in my house blow around with the wind, and that hadn't bothered me in the slightest until I read this moment of the book, and then I was freaked out by it. So full credit to the author there, that bit was very intense. When I say that it scared me, I'm not talking about the gruesomeness of the scenes, I'm talking about the well-craftedness of that one scene in particular and a few others. Unfortunately, those scenes are few and far between. The rest of it I just found okay. The biggest issue for me would be the character development. It sounds a bit cliched, but I thought the 2 main characters in particular, there just wasn't that much to them. They didn't really come out of the page for me. They both seemed quite flat. There's the police officer and there's the child psychologist who works at the Children's House. Neither of them really did anything for me to make me think that they were real characters. I think this is a really interesting contrast to Arnaldur Indridason, who's like the king of Icelandic crime writing. I've only read one of his, and it probably wasn't even his best, but the characters in that are really well fleshed out, and I was much more interested in them than I was in the crime, which sort of faded into the background. So yeah, those 2 Icelandic authors are quite different on that front. Other Nordic authors which spring to mind as good character authors are Leif Persson, who, if you've read any of his stuff, you know his characters are very interesting, and Liza Marklund even, who I don't really rate, but again, her characters are quite strong. So that's something that I think Yrsa could stand to work on, and if she was able to keep up the intensity of the crime scenes, as well as flesh out her characters better, I think we would have some really excellent crime novels. The last thing I'll say about the plot itself is that I have seen comments online and whatnot that say the ending is far-fetched and that no one would be motivated to go that far for that reason. Yeah, true, but the crimes were so psychotic that I couldn't really have ever believed that anyone would go that far for any reason, so I wasn't really expecting a super believable conclusion. For me, the bigger problem lies in the fact that there were not enough breadcrumbs to lead us to that conclusion. Basically, you can't guess the ending based on what happens because there are just almost no clues there. And in my opinion, a crime novel is never going to be really excellent if I couldn't have got to that conclusion but still missed it. But the ending did at least take me by surprise, so that was fine. I didn't really have a big issue with that part of the novel. Now, we need to talk about translation, because when you read a translated work, as this book is, you're not actually reading the craft of the author. The plot is by the author, sure, but the craft of what you're reading, the person who puts it into words, is the translator. And it's often overlooked by people who read, because if you ask anyone who the last book they read was translated by, if indeed it was a translated book, many of them couldn't tell you. They could probably tell you the name of the author, but they can't tell you the name of the translator. Nevertheless, translation awards, like literary awards for translation, exist. So we know that it's very important, and if you read a well-translated thing compared to a poorly translated thing, you can see the difference for yourself. It's very clear. And this particular English translation by Victoria Cribb is one of the worst I've ever read. I'm not trying to be mean. There's no other way to say it. It's just awful. Victoria Cribb is not an author, and it shows. When I googled her name, I found some comments from her that sort of read like admissions that she doesn't really know what she's doing. She said things like, "What I struggle with is putting the Icelandic into English." She also said that she can struggle with the 3-month time limit, and that doesn't surprise me because as you go further through the book, the language becomes increasingly random and as if she was in a hurry, and it has to be said Google Translate-ish in its tone. For starters, there's a bunch of misused idioms, and if you think I'm being pedantic, they're just the sort of thing that act like a speed hump in the reading. You're just reading along, da-da-da-da, and then you go, hang on, I must have misread that, and you go back and you... What? That's not what we say. There are also quite a few double adverbs. Now that's not against the rules, but I'm talking about adverbs on top of adverbs that serve to contradict one another, like usually always. He usually always went to meetings. Now, I know that technically you can have usually always, but it's such a clumsy way to say it. Better would be to say something like, usually he attended every meeting, or something like that. There's also almost invariably. Almost invariably just means most of the time. There's also a bunch of language that just doesn't match the tone of what's happening, or the mood of who's saying it, or the abilities of who's saying it. For example, there's one scene with a 7-year-old girl where she was saying things that made me think, is this 7-year-old girl an academic lecturer? Because she should be. And that's all part of what I would actually say is the biggest problem of this writing, which is thesaurus writing. Oh my goodness, there was some thesaurus writing. If you don't know what that is, it's when you go to the thesaurus to find bigger, fancier, normally more archaic words for things that you could say with ordinary language, but you think it sounds better with fancier language. If you look at good authors, they never do this. They always use words that we all understand to paint vivid pictures. Ultimately, the prose in The Legacy is so bad that it makes me never want to read anything translated by Victoria Cribb again. But I would be keen to see how much better Yrsa's work is when translated by someone else, and some of her other books have been translated by different Icelandic to English translators. So there's a guy called Philip Rowton, there's Bernard Scudder and Anna Yates. Philip Rowton has won a translation award for one of his other books, so I can only assume that there would be a positive difference. Speaking of which, I want to read this next, or probably not next on my list, but soon. It's called About the Size of the Universe by Jon Kalman Stefánsson, and it's translated by Philip Rowton. He's supposed to be a very good translator, and this has very good reviews. It's supposed to be really good, so when I'm done, I will let you know my thoughts on that. Would I recommend DNA or The Legacy? Not the English translation. I don't think it exists in any other translation, so basically, if I'm to recommend this book, it's going to be in the original Icelandic for those of you who speak it. It is quite tense at times, so if you're looking for something really tense, something really noirish, then this might do you. It's not really the pinnacle of crime writing, but it definitely goes okay. As I said, not in the English, only if you speak Icelandic. I've now read books by the 3 most well-known Icelandic crime writers, that is Yrsa, Arnaldur, and Ragnar Jonasson. And what I've been really impressed by is the fact that they don't feel copied from each other at all. You'd probably only need about half a page to be able to tell who's writing what. If you enjoyed Trapped, the Icelandic TV series, and quite frankly, I can't help you if you didn't, but if you did, I would recommend Ragnar Jonasson. Jonasson is the one who, in my opinion, writes that claustrophobia that Trapped did so well. He writes that the best of all 3 of them. Anyway, I think that's more than enough from me. Please let me know in the comments what you think of any of this. Have you read something by any of these authors, by Yrsa or any of the others? Keep the subscribes coming so that I can feel encouraged to make more of these. Wherever you are, I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.